So back in the days of black and white, when we were 30 people, you know, innovation was pretty easy. You could have mad people come in and say about weather patterns. That wasn't a problem. The problem comes when you're working on something like Fable, the Fable franchise, and terrifyingly, you know, there's almost 100 people that worked on Fable. And the last thing you want is a designer marching in there saying he's had another great idea, because you probably, well, my life expectancy would be probably measured in minutes these days. The other thing is that over the years, you know, as Lionhead's got bigger and as the people have got there, lots of people have cool ideas. It's not just designers, it's certainly not just me. And because we just focus on, you know, more and more in this industry, we're doing the game. There's no forum for these people to experiment. There's no forum for them to innovate. And if someone has a really bright idea, what do? Well, you know, a lot of times, I tell you what they do, you know, they leave your company and they go somewhere else because the idea is so smart. So without that forum to experiment and to innovate, without the ability to do that, then, you know, I think that can be a massive negative. So those are pretty good justifications for what experiments are. Also, the big win is it gets around my nasty habits of experimenting late. It really helps explore the ideas, however risky. I mean, Fable 2, well, maybe we should have done this, I don't know, but you know, the fact that we did put those innovations in there, anything from ambient orbs to the dog to the breadcrumb trail, I mean, we didn't have to do that, but we only did that because we experimented in smaller test beds with those ideas first. So I'm going to be showing you some of those test beds earlier on. I think if it worked, if me as a designer and us as a design team, if we didn't have these experimental groups here, then we just wouldn't have been able to experiment with what we did in Fable 2. It also, obviously, and everything comes down to cost these days more than ever before, it comes down to a big cost issue. If you can have a small, very small experimental team that costs, you know, a man-month to do an experiment, it's much more likely that you can do more experiments and throw them away and hybrid them more. So there's some of the justifications. What are they at Lionhead? Well, anyone can start up an experimental team. They are a fast way of prototyping risky ideas from team members, especially designers. Designers are great for coming up with creative ideas. They're not the best people to implement those ideas, but they're great to do that. They're short-term projects. They have 1 to 5 people on them. They tend to take place at the end of a project when the team members are free. So we really encourage people at Lionhead to have those creative ideas, and then when they've finished a big project, they can have 1 to 3 months to execute that idea and match them up together, and that really, really works well. And they can last anything from 1 to 12 weeks, with the average being about 4 weeks. And most of the demos, all except one that I'm going to give today, did last around about 4 to 6 weeks. They're structured, well, firstly, anybody at Lionhead can kick off and propose an experiment. And the way they do that is they get a sponsor from a senior member of staff. It could be me, it could be our technical director called Tim Rance, it could be the head of the Fable franchise, Louise Copley, but there needs to be that senior member of staff just to act as a kind of shepherd for this experiment. These sponsors then sell the idea to this creative board we've got at Lionhead. The creative board is made up of about 8 people at Lionhead. Most of them are senior members, but there's 1 or 2 junior members on that creative board. And we meet once every 1 to 3 months, and we go through all the propositions for all the experiments. And the sponsor then stands up and sells the idea of the experiment. So it's not as free and as loose that anyone can start experimenting with anything straight away because there needs to be some structure to that. And then those experiments are all put together and they're voted on, and then the top 1, 2, or 3, depending on how much free time we got, then go forward into sort of mini production. They are given a producer, they're scheduled like anybody else. They have little mini milestones. Those milestones could last as short as a day, or they could be as long as a week, or as long as a month in extreme cases. And they have these checkpoints. They're reviewed again by the sponsor very, very regularly, and they're reviewed by the creative board. When they come back to that board, we then ask some very simple questions, depending on what this experiment is. Because the experiment could be a new form of art, it could be a new tool that we use, it could be a game design mechanic, it could be a new animation technique. It's a whole variety of different experiments. And we have to sit, as a board, we have to sit down and measure the success of that experiment. And I know some of these questions seem very, very obvious, but quite often I find myself, when I ask myself these questions, it forces you to be real about what you're doing. So the first thing is why we're doing this experiment, what it's for, what it adds, how it makes people excited, if that's applicable. It's what you see, it's how often you see it in the game. If for example, you're going to see some experiments about the dog. If the dog was only going to be seen in Fable 2 for 10 minutes, then it's far less likely to be a successful experiment than, as was the case with Fable 2, the dog was there pretty much all the time. How much will it cost to make? There's one thing is making the experiment, but how that moves forward. If it's going to be hugely costly, we've got some very interesting examples about ray tracing I'm going to be showing very briefly, and that turned out to be extremely costly to implement because of the tool chain necessary. How you describe this to a player, if this is applicable. We found that as a big gate. Is quite often there were some game concepts that people had, or little game ideas, but they failed because they were just a little bit too complex to describe to the player. To make sure that as many people at Lionhead can experiment, we've got a suite of tools that help with that experimental process. And that includes a very, very simple prototyping engine. And this prototyping engine enables even layman coders to play around with an experiment. We found that especially useful for scripters. Maybe they weren't into deep coding logic and they couldn't display anything on screen. They wouldn't, have the first idea to do any 3D stuff, but they had cool ideas. So what we developed was a prototype engine which kind of stripped out all of the unnecessary baggage. Okay, graphically, these prototypes didn't look amazing, but they enabled people to get to the core of the idea as quickly as possible. So that was one engine that people could use. One version of that, interestingly, all the code for that engine was written in such a way so it could be compiled into one file. So it was very, very portable, so it really meant people could get into it very quickly. Very easy and accessible functions. The other way is to use existing game engines, and you're going to see some of this. Use Fable 1, use Black and White, really again, to use the existing technology we've got to get to the core of the idea. I mean, a lot of the times I find that we kind of give ourselves the excuses, oh, well, it's not fun yet because the graphics aren't right, or because the sound isn't right, or because a host of other reasons. Now, if we can use our existing tech to get around that, it means that people get to the core of the experiment as quickly as possible. What we've also done is we've been working on for a while, and this is kind of a whole talk in itself, on some technology called concrete. And concrete started itself as an experiment, and it's the dream of concrete, and this was a dream that we kind of had, was, you know, this industry talks so much about sharing code and sharing engines and sharing AI, but, you know, maybe there's some fundamental things that we should do before we can do that. And so we created this framework called concrete. And the idea is, this is the long vision, the idea in concrete is, if when you create any asset, and by an asset I mean everything from a piece of graphic to an animation to a piece of code, if there is a framework in it which allows that asset to essentially, and I'm skimming over the details massively, to essentially talk to other objects and be compatible with other objects, then this dream starts to become a reality. And the dream was, imagine you had a game like Fable and a game like Black and White. Why shouldn't you be able to pick up an asset from one game, literally, physically, pick up a tree from Black and White and put it into Fable? Why shouldn't that work? Can't we get some sort of technology which allows us to create those assets with a common framework? So we're on this level 1 of concrete, which kind of almost allows us to do that. The big dream is that me as a designer would then be able to pick the landscape from one game, the trees from another game, the villagers and their AI from another game, combine them all together and make a game in 48 hours. Obviously, that is still an absolute dream and nowhere near reality, and if it was, then, well, we'd make a game a week, I guess, but we're not nearly there. So but what concrete has allowed us to do is a lot of these prototypes have used assets from other games and other libraries that we keep at Lionhead. So after we have assessed a prototype, after we've gone through all the experimental stages, after we've creatively tick-boxed them, after we've reviewed them, it comes to the final gate of we ask ourselves simply, should this be used in the game that we're making? And the next step is that this is all handed over to production, and then it's costed, and we create a risk profile for it. The original creator, even though they may not have that particular skill in spades, then still works with the team until that's fully implemented. The designers are briefed so that design uses this experiment. I mean, quite often in the early days, we made the mistake of having these experiments, putting them into a game, but nobody used them. They just sort of wallowed there as little things on their own. So it's very important that design kind of embraces them and uses them. And if it is applicable, and we've already done this a number of times, I think we've got 6 or 7 patents on going through at the moment on our experiments, we'll actually apply for a patent for some of those experiments. So, I'm going to just take a little tiny break. If anyone's got any questions in this time about the process before we move on to the demo itself, to some of the demos itself, because I think they'll probably take up, quite a bit of time. So does anyone have any questions about experiments or the concept of experiments, what we're doing and why we're doing it? So a question down here, excitingly. Very good question. Do we limit ourselves to Lionhead assets? No, we don't. I'm a huge fan of using whatever you can to get to the core of the idea as quick as you can. So often, and when I hear this, as a designer, I hear, well, it's not good yet because of X, Y, and Z. So often I found that tends to be an excuse. So we do try and use anything from music to animations to even arts to really try and get to the core of that idea. Anybody else? A question? Yeah.
You said at the end of the project, do you mean like the end of a game, or it's like a milestone in the development of
Yeah, the question was, when I said at the end of the project, what did I actually mean? What I mean was that, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room have found this, is when you get to the end of a game, like at the end of Fable 1, for example, there is this fallow time where you're kind of waiting for, you know, everything to get ready for the next game. And that fallow time, quite often in the past, people would, you know, they'd obviously do, you know, very sensible things of catching up with their lives and doing some learning, and but interestingly, some people have this, you know, have this fire in the belly for a particular idea, and that end of the project time is the perfect time. But it's not always the case. It's not always done at the end of the project. You know, we have had people who've had, you know, such a cool experiment they want to do. They have, if they are not hurting the project itself, have sidelined off to this project for a couple of weeks. Yeah, question? Yeah. Yeah, the experiments themselves, I mean, some of them are like strike teams, and this was the question, do we form strike teams? They are like strike teams. We use agile development techniques sometimes. Sometimes it's applicable to use more traditional production methodology. It really depends on the particular experiment. If it's a little bit of a larger team, then we tend to use a more agile development technique. Yep. Very good question, and this is a problem. You're absolutely right. The question was, with downloadable content, does this give us less time? Well, these days, yes, you're right. These days, more and more, we're finding that, you know, that lovely sort of summer holiday you have at the end of a project is getting less and less and less. But here's the thing, you know, I think these experiments are so valuable that it's right and proper for a number of people to make time for those experiments, because, you know, there's such a structure and there's been such success with them. You know, I think you can turn around to, you know, people and say, look, these 5 people are going off and experimenting on this. Here's the massive win. Okay, we're going to lose them for a couple of weeks, but, you know, it's not a disaster. Last question, anyone? Yes, thank God. Where does the money come from? Well, we do an amount of busking on the streets. That's the first part of the experiment. The money is a very important point. I mean, I think we essentially that money is attributed against a project. You know, we have a central group within Lionhead called CTG, Central Technology Group. And if an experiment is going to be for, say, Fable, then the cost will be borne by the Fable project. If it's going to be, God, I almost said what project we were working on. That would have been a disaster. If it's borne by the other project, then it goes across that one. And if it's for general sort of central technology, or it's something that could be used by other projects, now I'm getting really nervous that I would make a slip, then it's borne by this Central Technology Group, which has a budget of its own. I mean, we've actually found it rare that we can't justify it financially, because you're not talking about, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're talking about, you know, a very small amount of money. And because there are these milestones and checkpoints, you know, it's rare, although not always the case. There is one example where it kind of ran off with the fairies for a while. Okay, let's have a look at some examples of these prototypes. And some of these are going to be live demos. It's a bit scary. And some of them are going to be videos. So the first one I want to really look at is the dog. Now, this was a classic example of a designer, happened to be me, it's not always me, a designer coming in and saying, hey, I've got a good idea. Why don't we have a dog in Fable 2? Is everyone here familiar with Fable 2? Do I need to go through what the concept is? Anyone want me to go through the concept of Fable 2? Great. So let's just show you the first example of that prototype. And my mouse is not working. That's a serious problem. It is working now, although very inconveniently. Okay, so this is dog version 1. I'll just get to the video the right place in the video. Should have some sound, I think. Have we got sound? No, we haven't got sound. That's all right. It's all right. We haven't got sound on this one. So this is the first example, and the first thing, as you see, we had this nodding dog, because the first thought that we had, it's a bit rubbish, isn't it? The first thought we had in the dog in Fable 2 is, why don't we have punishing and rewarding? And the idea was that you could use this and move your hand up and down. Because everyone immediately went to the dog's bottom and started poking their finger in places that their finger shouldn't go. But that was beside the point. But we went through this experiment. This experiment perhaps took, I think it took a total of 2 weeks to do. And we came to the realization that, I don't know what that bit was, we came to the realization that really this didn't make a dog feel like a dog. It made it feel like, well, it made it feel like a bit like a creature out of black and white, and that was kind of being generous. It took us further away from what our ideal was, and we came back and asked ourselves, right, when we had a meeting about it, what do we really want from the dog in Fable 2? And what we really wanted was this feeling of bonding with the dog. And we went into a room with this experimental team, and we wrote all the things that were important on the wall. And it turned out from that, and from playing around with this experiment, that, you know what, we should drop punishing and rewarding of the dog in Fable 2 because of this 2-week experiment. Now, if it hadn't been for this experiment, we would have had to wait probably a year to actually come to that conclusion. But we didn't collapse that little experiment team. Instead, they went back and they experimented with something else. And this is probably one of the most valuable experiments, and certainly one of the fastest experiments we ever did. And it was using the Fable 1 engine. And what we did was, we used one of the creatures, which is called a balverine, to do doggy stuff, rather than put a dog into Fable. And the experiment was, why don't we think how the dog can actually move and be a companion to the player? And by simply putting the dog in front of the player, rather than, as usual in a lot of computer games, behind the player, we suddenly found, this is the wrong bit, by the way, suddenly found we could have a huge hammer. No, not really. We suddenly found that we could have, there was this connection with the dog. You weren't relying upon him anymore. You didn't feel like he was a burden to you. He felt like he was in some way leading you, rather than you were dragging him along. And that very short experiment really worked fantastically well. So there was that was a real fantastic success. Let's move on to some of the smaller experiments that we've been working on. Some of them have been in games, some of them have appeared in games, and some of them haven't. I'm just going to quickly talk through them. The first thing is that, well, you just saw that the dog was an example of a design-led experiment. This is an example of a lighting-based experiment. A really, really smart programmer called Mark Adami. He was working on a project, he was working on navigation routines. He came to someone called Tim Rance at Lionhead and said, look, I want to try some ray tracing stuff. And, his idea was so strong that he was given a vacation from doing, tedious navigation stuff, and he worked on this experiment. And actually, the results are pretty cool. I mean, you can see the blue car and the red car. And if I sort of zoom forward here, there's, not that bit. Where is it? Not that bit. And you can see that some of those, resulted in some really cool stuff. And that seems like a huge success, but then, and that got through all our gates, but then when it was costed, and we realized the enormous amount of work it would be for our tools chain, and the enormous amount of change, that experiment was actually put on the shelf. Another example of an experiment was Again, someone else had a really good idea of actually using the graphics chip to create, sorry, I'll just pause it on that one. Not that, all right. Is to actually to use the graphics chip to create thousands and thousands of animations and creatures, and it's something that when there was this piece of technology was too late for Fable 2, we may end up using it in future, who knows, but you know, having that sort of feeling of an incredible amount of life within a game would be absolutely great, and having that all on frame rate would be absolutely fantastic. We had another programmer, less technical programmer. He had this really cool idea with water and water mechanics and fluid mechanics. It's always been a passion, to try and use water more and more. So he came up with an experiment like this. This experiment, I think, took 10 days in total. It was just one coder. So, what I'm trying to give you as an impression is that there's lots of these little experiments. Some of them are used, and some of them aren't. Some of them are used in. They're using the creature to try and show about deformable skin and stuff like that. Using the graphics chip to do animations. Using lighting to get soft shadows. So there's a huge amount of experimentation. But let me show you one of the real successes. I think this is probably one of the most successful of all of our experiments. And the story goes like this. Someone called Adam Langridge at Lionhead was listening to a talk I was giving, and I was saying in this talk, it's so frustrating how computer games are so, inaccessible to a huge amount, and so how few people in this world actually are able to play combat games because the controls are always too complex. And he heard this talk, and he was really inspired, by what I said, and really inspired by my frustration. So he came up to me, the day after the talk, and he said, "Peter, I've got this really cool idea for something called one-button combat." He said, "I want to try and put a combat all on one button." And I said, "Well, that sounds really cool, Adam. You're working on some valuable stuff at the moment. Do you think you could do it?" We sat down and we went through the details of it. And he went off and used our prototype engine to do this. Now, we should definitely have sound here. No, there's no sound. What? You can hear it? Oh, you can hear it. Okay, so he produced this, and again, this was done in a remarkably short amount of time. The first version didn't have any music or sound effects in it, and we kind of came to it and we said, "Well, it doesn't feel quite right. Why don't you continue the experiment? We'll extend the experiment out and put music and sound effect in it." So, and the results was this, and I think this is fantastically cool. And actually, this experiment is slightly better than what we have at the moment in Fable 2. That's not knocking any of the hugely skilled people that have done their stuff in Fable 2, but the idea is that you just press this one button, and depending on where the player is, it gives a different context to the combat. So if I'm over here, there's nothing I can do, but I press the button and the player taunts, or the player will kind of kick a brick at somebody because their brick is round. If I'm over here and my opponent is nearby, I've got to punch him over there. That's a bit of a problem. Sorry, excuse me. Being a bit brutal. If anyone was on the ethics panel this morning, I apologise. Obviously, I don't like hitting people violently much. But if for example, I'm up against the wall, I can use the wall as a launch point, and that's all using one button. Now, I think that works incredibly well, and I think it is incredibly dramatic. That's there. And after we did that, the cost was enormously high from implementing that in Fable 2, but the reward was massive, because that did lead to the one-button combat. It led to us dropping the block button, simplifying the combat, and it led to us rethinking what was the range combat. So I think that was pretty cool, and that worked. Let me show you another one. And this is a strange one. This is one of the ones that didn't work terribly well. And it's called The Room. And these three guys were working on this, and they worked on this for quite some time. This was one of the longer experiments they did, and they had some really, really, really cool ideas. The first cool idea, and I'll kick it off, was this thing, stuff called clay. And let's just get to the right demo now. My mouse has got to work now. Let's just see if it works up here. It does. Run the empty thing first. Can I have the volume on the PC just a little bit higher? Not that high. Okay, so this brings a lot of, they actually used a lot of the experiments together, and they had, the first thing they want to do, which I'll talk about in a minute, is to try and create an environment which was different to other game environments. And so they spent a long time on, super high resolution kind of textures. Remember, this is about 3-4 years ago, and this is running on my little portable PC. The next thing they really experimented with, and all of this was enormously, massively exciting, was the idea of something called clay. And the idea of clay was we really love the idea of user-generated content, and how can you give them, this is a great idea behind this, how can you give sort of people a material they could play with which makes them feel more creative. So they came up with this stuff called clay. Why it comes out of a fireplace, who knows, but there you go. And clay is something that you can manipulate around. If I just pick up this piece of clay, I can start sort of manipulating this stuff around. And then if we sense this clay is anything sort of slightly realistic, or matches one of our templates, then the clay will actually turn into something. Now, this is actually quite tricky to do because the mouse isn't very sensitive, so just bear with me a second. I'm just building, this is just done with simple clicks. You can apply colour to clay, you can have different sort of materials as clay. And when the game senses, when the thing senses something made out of clay, this clay has turned into a kind of TV screen and a television. And on the television, I think you'll be able to see, is me. See, I'm there, hello. It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, it's using the webcam there, but it was all, there was a lot of this creative stuff. Another example of clay was you could make this stuff here. Just do this, and that will turn into a bowl of oranges, of course. What else would it be? And all of this worked with a kind of simple engine. Now, all of this was amazingly cool, and when we actually looked at it, each time we looked at it, our jaws dropped every single time. And this kind of project and experiment kept going, and there's some things in these experiments that we are going to use, but as a whole, it got really large. The other thing that this experiment did was something very, very interesting, which we're definitely going to be using in the future, and it was called portals. And it's these things here. Now, this has kind of already been, you've already seen this in a game called Portal, strangely enough. But, I know you're probably not going to believe me, but this was done before Portal was done, but they interestingly did some brilliant stuff with it. But the interesting thing is, you see I'm waggling this orange in front of that mirror, and you can see it come out of that mirror there. And then if I drop the orange through, it will, when the physics engine decides to, it will start to bubble out. Or will it? Let's try the bowl. That bastard bowl's not going in. It's a disaster. But you notice that this bowl actually is a little bit bigger, because the thing about portals, which is really exciting, which I think is really exciting, is that they will, depending on their size, depending on their attributes, they will change the object that's coming through. So you can see this orange is getting bigger and bigger, and if I do some crazy shit, man, I can just move this mirror in front of this mirror. This is going dreadfully well. And I can pick up this orange, and I can put this orange through here, like that. And let's move this mirror over there. Oh no, oh no! The two mirrors have joined. It's the end of the universe. So we kind of played around with that concept, that portal stuff, which I'll, if you're interested, I can show some people afterwards. It will work over live as well, so it will be a window into one person's room and another person's room, and this is something which I'd love to continue to play around with. They also, this amazing, amazing team, and some of the people on this team actually left to start Media Molecule, and they are the coolest people in the world, so you can see how smart they are. They also produced this, which is emotionally, if you look at this, how does this room make you feel? How does this setting kind of make you feel? This is a full room, and it's, I found this emotionally a really, really interesting thing. I had never seen a room like this in a computer game before. It looks like there's some old person that's kind of been sitting in this chair for kind of 50 years, and you can see where all the indentations are where they sat down, and I found that very inspiring. But at the end of the day, even though this tech was really cool and inspired us massively, it wasn't an experiment that really went anywhere further. And I think there's attributes in this experiment that are really interesting, but I think the very fact it didn't go any further, I think is really interesting.